The Web of Conspiracy. Here is your host, Adam Webb.
Hello, and welcome to another exciting edition of The Web of Conspiracy. I am your host, Adam Webb. It is great to be back with you again this week. I don't have much in the way of announcements. I've got a big show planned today, so I'm just going to touch on a few things and move right into the depth of the show. First off, I want to take a moment or two to thank everybody for continuing to support the show. You're the reason I continue to do this. I want to welcome all the new listeners. Thank you for tuning in, and hopefully you can find something entertaining to listen to. Once again, just thank you. Thank you for everybody for your support. I greatly appreciate it. Building on that, for those of you who really enjoy the show, I would welcome your feedback and your reviews. So however you listen to the show, whether it's via iTunes or Stitcher or Spreaker, please feel free. Please be willing, if you have a few minutes of your time to take, to write a little review. That way, first off, it gives me some feedback in terms of what it is that you like, what you don't like, and as well as give me a chance to get a little more spotlighted by the distributors and be able to attract some more listeners. So if you have a few moments of your time, I would greatly appreciate that. Now, after having said all that, I want to switch to this interview here with Jerret Gardner. Jerret's a fascinating guest, and I think you're going to really enjoy what he has for you today. Okay, well, I'm pleased to have as the very first guest on the Web of Conspiracy, Mr. Jerret Gardner. Jerret is a former Navy journalist, teacher, and a writer originally from California, now living in Japan. He has written a fascinating book called What Egyptologists Don't Want You to See, and there's Volume 1 and Volume 2 of that. Welcome, Jerret Gardner, to the show. It's great to have you today.
Thank you. It's great to be here, too.
Okay. And before we get into your work, tell us a little bit about yourself. What was it that prompted you to get involved in this research? Certainly as a former Navy journalist, what was it that brought you to Giza?
Let's see. It's many years ago, but when I was going to university, I was doing some freelance journalism work in San Diego for a magazine called Revolt and Style. And I decided to do a story on this convention that was going on in Laughlin, California. And while I was there was an individual who was doing a presentation about the Great Pyramids. And his theory was that the Great Pyramids were, the Great Pyramid in particular, was a solar reflector and collector device. So basically some kind of machine that would reflect and collect solar energy for whatever means they would use it for. And this individual happened to be the only one that had evidence to support what he was saying, so I found it kind of fascinating. So I ended up meeting up with him and doing an interview, and over the course of the weekend there, it turned out that he needed a videographer to go to accompany his team back to Egypt. So I offered to do that, and that was my first trip back in 1997. So we went back in 1998. This was through a non-profit organization called the American Anthropological Research Foundation. And both trips were 2 weeks long, and it's your first trip there. It's amazing, regardless of what you think about the Great Pyramids. Just seeing them there for the first time, it's completely unbelievable to see them firsthand. And then to know that there are these theories floating around that this was a giant machine, it's even more, makes your trip even more amazing. So from that point on, it has always held a certain fascination for me. So I ended up going back in 2000 by myself to do my own basic video project, and nothing really came of that. But later on, I joined the Navy as a journalist, and then in 2009, I found out that I basically realized I had the opportunity to go back, and my idea was the books you mentioned, what Egyptology doesn't want you to see. And my idea was to go for 30 days and travel all the way from Alexandria to the Great Pyramids, all the way from 500 miles, south down the Nile to Abu Simbel, and basically all the pyramids and temples in between. And the goal was to try and find the evidence and take, decent photographs, and then be able to present that in a photo illustrated book. And so that's what I attempted to do, and that's what I put together with volumes 1 and volume 2. So a lot of times you'll read books on different individuals' theories, but they're lacking in what I thought was, concrete photographic evidence. So that was the attempt on my part.
Well, I have to admit, from my perspective as being a trained historian, typically in the field there, the rule is, well, we need to have as much content, we need as much evidence, much concrete evidence, and we have to make this as dense as possible. What I find as refreshing as I do about your work is that you're really presenting this in a way that lots of people can understand it, follow it. It's not anything that's going to be way above anybody's head. This is something that anybody can pick up, read, understand, and not only that, but see the evidence that you've put forth here. So I commend you on that, because far too often you have scholars and researchers that they're presenting for other scholars and researchers. So
right.
I think that your approach is unique, and I think it's a valid approach and one that is far too often overlooked. So that being said, let's talk a little bit about, in this first chapter of the book, you mentioned something that I myself had not been familiar with. Now, I've heard of the area there being some possible flooding, but you point out something very interesting about tidal erosion patterns. Please elaborate a little bit more on that for us.
Yeah, sure. That's chapter 1 of volume 1. And this is the work of Sharif El-Morsi, who I had a chance to interview in 2010. He is an Egyptian researcher. He studied at the University of Libya, I believe. And what he discovered is pretty amazing. Before reading about him and his work, I would look at these blocks of the pyramid and the erosion that's on there, and it's just dumbfounding. You look at one block, and about 3/4 of it has just disappeared because of the amount of erosion, and it's pocketed with pits and almost looking like a Swiss cheese. And it doesn't look like wind erosion traditionally. So when Sharif El-Morsi came along, and it just explained everything and cleared everything up. Basically, he surveyed the whole plateau and found many forms of tidal erosion, which I'll go into right now. One of the first he found was Tafoni pitting, which is basically when the waves crash upon, any geological surface. In this case, we're talking about pyramid blocks. The sea spray and the sand that's in the water and the salt, they just bash against the blocks repetitively, and the weaker parts of the stone erode first, which create these little circular pockets and almost make it look like I mentioned before, Swiss cheese is the closest example I could sort of give to you. And this is a repetitive thing, and like I said, in some cases, 3/4 of the pyramid stone has been eroded, and then the Tafoni pitting is still there. So it must have, according to Sharif El-Morsi, it took centuries to take that much stone away from that block to leave only 1/4 of the block left, and then you still see the Tafoni pitting on there, which means that this was, being bashed by the sea for, hundreds of years, according to him. And that's just one of the tidal erosion patterns, and this is found on the external casing stone of one of the second Great Pyramid blocks. So it's the external casing block, which most of them are stripped away now. This was as a result of Al-Mamun, who in 820 AD he had a campaign to break inside the Great Pyramid, and right now the entrance that most tourists use is the actual entrance that he broke through using, I believe he took fire and then he poured cold vinegar on it and then hit it with a battering ram, and then it would crack the block. And anyway, he broke into the Great Pyramid and didn't find anything, so then his men started taking the casing blocks away. Well, some of them still remain, and thank God for that, because we were able to find this, or he was able to find this Tafoni pitting. I found some myself on a different block, and those are the photos that are in my book. So that's one form of tidal erosion. And many people have often said that, well, obviously the pyramids, back in the day where it was much greener and lush and there was, rainfall, but this is not what we're talking about at all. We're talking about the sea. We're talking about the Mediterranean Sea.
Right.
At the very least, coming up to the foot of the pyramids and surrounding the second Great Pyramid, and causing, having a tidal flow of, high tide and low tide, and just bashing the blocks for, a period of 100 years or so, where nobody was living there at all. It was, basically these three little islands, in the sea, basically.
Right. Now, how high up do these erosion patterns present?
Well, there's some seashells, too, which are found, which Sharif El-Morsi found one. It's basically a type of sea urchin, and it's fossilized now, so the exoskeleton is basically petrified. And inside the exoskeleton, limestone made its way in there and then fossilized. And it's stuck to the top. This one in particular is stuck to the top flat surface of a third Great Pyramid temple block, which is about, I would say, roughly 15 feet high. So this sea creature found its way, on top of this block, via the sea. So how high above that? Sea urchins are basically tidal creatures. If you know a sea urchin, they got the long spikes, and
right.
If you step on them, they're going to give you some pain and whatnot. But so they're usually around the shoreline and stuff, or the tidal pool, basically. So 15 feet plus another 5 feet on top of that, perhaps, or 10 feet, or...
Okay.
I don't know. It may have been different levels at different times, and most likely it was, due to geology and the way things move. But from what we see as evidence, that would be the highest level so far. There's another type, like I said, there's two other types of tidal erosion, and one of them is alluvial sediment deposits. And this is basically sediment deposits that were moved by the sea, by the tidal flows, and were deposited on top of some of these blocks, on top and around. And in most cases, these things petrified as well, because the amount of time we're talking about, the pyramids having been there. And petrification or fossilization can happen apparently in a few hundred years. So, but we know that a few hundred years ago there was no ocean surrounding the Great Pyramids. That's
right.
the main difference here. But so you have some blocks that are completely disfigured because of this alluvial sediment that is built up around it, and it's fossilized into limestone too, and the blocks are limestone. So it's really difficult to ascertain what's going on when you first look at these things. You need to subtract the sediment deposits from the block, and in order to see the block behind it, basically. And in some cases, the sediment deposits have had wind erosion cut into them as well, so it's really quite difficult. You need to have a really good trained eye to see this. And so I tip my hat to Sharif El-Morsi for even figuring this out. And so the sediment deposits happen on top of some of the Sphinx Temple, next to the Sphinx, the very highest blocks there. That's that's the low part of the plateau. It's one of the lowest parts of the plateau. The pyramids sit higher than that, so the third Great Pyramid Temple is actually a lot higher than that. But we find the alluvial sediment deposits there. I found some more in the second Great Pyramid Temple, which is higher up. And then the last form of tidal erosion that Sharif El-Morsi found was deep saltwater saturation. I don't know if there's an official term for it, but basically the lowest blocks on the plateau absorb the most amount of seawater, and the salt makes its way into the cracks and pores, and then when the sea finally receded, the sunlight would be baking the plateau and the blocks, and that's the salt crystals would expand and then basically shatters the block into thousands of little fragments. And you find this all over the plateau, and just where you'd expect to find it, on the lowest blocks that would have absorbed the most amount of seawater. So when you take all three forms of tidal erosion into consideration and the different locations that you find them, it just points to there's something else that I would need to add in there. There's another individual who said, he's in my book as well, but he's basically proved that the blocks of the pyramid were a poured concrete, a poured stone, a limestone.
Correct.
So a lot of the geologists, their argument is, well, yeah, these blocks have tuffoni pitting on them because they were cut from the foundation, which used to be a prehistoric fossilized ocean floor. So of course there's tuffoni pitting on these blocks. And of course there's deep saltwater saturation affecting them. But if the blocks were poured concrete, which basically there was a team of experts from, I think it was the Cairo University. They went out there and they were able to test the north and south pole of the blocks. So this would tell them definitively if the blocks were cut from some other location, some other quarry, and then transported and then put into place. If they were cut and transported and put into place, then the north and south poles of each block would be completely random. One north and south pole would be maybe aligned to east and west, and another block would be, south and north, and so on and so on.
Right.
Well, what they found was that basically, I don't know the exact percentage, but I would be safe to say around 70% of the blocks that they found, the poles were all north and south, which suggested to them that the blocks were poured in place. Like they would pour one block in a mold, basically, let it set, and they would work their way around the pyramid, basically, until they came to the next level, and they would pour again. And so the magnetic poles are always going to be in the same direction because
right.
they're pouring a fluid element that's hardening over time, and so they basically discovered that recently. So knowing that the blocks are poured, and you have 3/4 of some of these blocks missing due to erosion, and you find the tuffoni pitting still there, then that tells you that that there was a flood, basically. And not only that, you have the alluvial sediment deposits, which alluvial means moved by water.
Right.
And so the only way alluvial sediment deposits can get on top of the highest block in the Sphinx Temple and get on top of, up and around the blocks of the second Great Pyramid is by, the tide. So when you take all three of those into consideration, plus, the recent theory that's basically been proven that the blocks were poured, then you're left with a pretty solid argument that there was a huge flood that caused all of this damage.
Right. Now, it's important to note that the mainstream does think a flood happened. However, they believe it happened before the pyramids and any of this stuff was created.
Right.
So what you're suggesting, based on the evidence here, is that the mainstream is wrong in that these floods occurred when the pyramids were already in place.
Right.
Which
Because there's seashells all over the place,
Right.
and they've known about this for fossilized seashells all over the place, petrified exoskeletons from these seashells, and they've known about this for a long time. People have been kicking them around and stuff like that. But like you said, they believe that happened much earlier than the pyramid. The pyramids were built later.
Right. So what you're suggesting is that the pyramids, based on this evidence, are most likely significantly older than what any mainstream archaeologist, Egyptologist, or historian currently believes.
Correct.
Okay. Well, it's pretty amazing stuff. I mean, I have to admit, I've always been fascinated. I've never had the pleasure of traveling there or being able to witness it, in person. But based on your work here, there's definitely something more, and there's definitely more research that needs to be done here. Now, there's, in the next section in your book here, you go into, and you start talking a little bit about some of the technologies that are used. Particularly, you talk about these core drill marks. Could you elaborate and kind of explain, because I'm looking at the pictures in this, and for the record, for everybody listening, I'm going to post links onto the social media pages as well as my website. And I'll put links to Jerret's websites as well, so you can take a look at some of this. But there is some pretty amazing pictures you've taken of these core drill marks that they look like it's something that was done today. The technology involved seems to suggest something greater here. Could you elaborate a little bit more into that?
Yeah, sure. Core drill, for those people that may not know, is it's basically caused by the drill bit, and it's a circular drill bit which is hollow in the center, and usually fairly deep. In this case, we find holes that were drilled into the blocks that are about 3 inches in diameter and about 7 inches deep. That's the normal one. Some of these core drill holes are actually about 6 inches in diameter. Some of the largest were found in limestone by... all of these were first found by Flinders Petrie, who was one of the first Egyptologists back in 1880, 1890. And he found some of them in limestone, which were about, if I recall, about 16 inches in diameter. And they were used to cut the limestone down to a base foundation, just get rid of a lot of bulk material, basically, to flatten something out. And pretty amazing considering when you look at the Great Pyramid today, and you can see that large amounts of the plateau have been leveled down, so the pyramids could actually sit inside the plateau a little bit. In particular, the Second Great Pyramid has a wall that goes all the way around it, so where they leveled the plateau down. Well, these core drill holes, like I said, were found by Flinders Petrie back in 1880, 1890. So one of the main arguments when I show these to some people is like, well, maybe somebody, took a machine over there and just started cutting rocks, maybe 10 years ago. Well, no, and no, for another reason, is there's, you could hook up a core drill bit to a hand drill, but you're not going to get anywhere fast because it's going to burn the motor up quite quickly, because a lot of these core drills are in granite, and they're even in basalt, which is even harder than granite, and sometimes diorite, which is even harder than basalt. So, going back to the original source, which was Flinders Petrie, he was one of the first Egyptologists, like I said. He was called, back in his day, he was called the father of modern Egyptology. Lots of praise was bestowed upon him because of his accurateness, his completeness in examination, and his attention to detail. Well, he found some of the cores that came out of the hole that were broken, the stone, so it's like a cylindrical piece that would fit into the hole. And that was the part that was extracted because presumably the builders didn't need that. They wanted the hole there for some purpose. And he actually found one of the famous ones is in his museum in London. And it's a cylindrical granite piece, and it's actually got the line from the tool. It's a spiral line that goes around the cylindrical stone, and in 1 inch there's about 60 lines. I say lines, but it's actually one line that spirals around. So if you count them in 1 inch, you get 60, which gives you a feed rate of 1 inch for every 60 revolutions of the drill bit, which is an amazing ratio.
Absolutely.
A diamond-tipped drill bit going through granite today with I looked it up a while ago with a motor that turns like 900 revolutions per minute or something like that. Will take 5 minutes to get 1 inch, and so this thing was cutting through. If we're to take this as for what it looks like, 1 inch for every 60 revolutions of the bit. So whatever the cutting surface was of this thing is something that we don't even have right now.
Right.
And these are found all over the place, but in particular, Petrie found them on the Great Pyramid. He found the core piece he found in the Great Pyramid. And if you go inside the Great Pyramid today, and if you go towards the Queen's Chamber, on your way there, the floor will drop about a foot and a half. When you reach that point, you should look up and to the sides. You will see that there are core drill holes on the sides, as if there was some sort of door that used to, swing open and swing shut flat against the part of the foundation that drops down, like I mentioned. And they're also found in Abu Sir, which I took a lot of photographs for Volume 2. But a lot of them are in Volume 1 as well. I do compare them to modern drill holes. So I have a photograph of a modern core drill hole that was done here in Japan with a diamond chip drill bit. It's the same, looks to be the same diameter, about 3 inches, as the most common drill holes found in Egypt. And like you said, it just looks remarkable. They look almost the same. The only difference is you can slightly tell that the one found in Egypt has a little bit more age to it.
Right.
But you can, even in the hole itself, you can see the lines from the tool as where it cut. And one of these in particular that was found in Abu Sir, either while they were cutting it, the block cracked and broke, or they drilled the hole and they used the stone for whatever means, and then over the millennia, the block fell over and broke and cracked, after the destruction. Either one, I'm not sure, what it is, but basically what it resulted in is a cross section of the core drill hole, which is it's basically amazing because you could see all the way into the core drill hole. And when you get to the end of the drill, you can actually see how thin the drill bit was, because of how it dug into the rock and it left a little bit of the core that's sticking out. So it was only about, from my eye, about 3 millimeters, 2 to 3 millimeters thick. So the material that they were using to cut through this stone it must have been incredibly strong, because it's only 3 millimeters thick.
Right.
And it's cutting through it like butter. I mean, to use Petrie's words, if I can find the quote here, here it is. The amount of pressure shown by the rapidity with which the drills and saws pierced through the hard stones is very surprising. Probably a load of at least a ton or two was placed on the 4-inch drills cutting in granite. So, now let me continue here. On granite core number 7, the spiral of the cut sinks 1 inch in the circumference of 6 inches, or 1 in 60, a rate of plowing out the quartz and feldspar which is astonishing. So this is Flinders Petrie, who had a history in mechanical engineering before he got into doing his archaeological work. And so he knew basically all the machines of his day, which was 1880, 1890. And this is his direct quote, talking about, these core drill holes and the cores that came out of them that he discovered back in that time. So, and these are brushed under the table by modern Egyptologists today. For many years they were.
Well, it's absolutely remarkable. And as I said before, having the photographic evidence, being able to see, the ancient one versus one that was created modern, it's amazing, and how remarkable the similarity is. And to look at the evidence suggesting that they used a technology that appears to be far superior than anything we have today. It's absolutely remarkable to me.
Right.
Building on that, and you touched on it briefly in your quote, but there's also some evidence of the use of some sort of high-powered saw tools as well.
Right. When you go there, and most people, they're staring up at the pyramid, and so they walk right over this stuff. Because, your eye naturally wants to gravitate towards the top of the pyramid, basically.
Right.
And if you're a tourist, that's your main reason to be there anyways, to go there and to see that. So when I'm there, it's the opposite. My head's like down at the ground. I'm looking under the rocks and stuff. So, and a lot of these saw marks are found right at the base of the Great Pyramid. There's a basalt block foundation, or not? It's on top of the limestone foundation, so it's kind of like a platform. And most of it's not there anymore. Only about 1/4 of it remains. A lot of it was stripped away, but when you walk around this particular area and you look at these basalt blocks, if you spend any longer than 10 minutes there, you will find saw marks. And they're basically all over the place. And Petrie, again, was the first person to discover these. And I've got some excellent photographs in my book of those. And some of them, which I call test cuts, or either that or just mistakes, they're found, sitting by the plateau as well. And that, in such a case, it's where the blade was sunk into the block and then extracted. So the full cut was never made for whatever reason. So it was abandoned for, whatever reason. And those are all over the place too. And Christopher Dunn, who wrote an excellent book as well, he's mentioned in my book a little bit. He found some of these. He was one of the first persons to photograph them and put them up online. And I photographed those and put them in my book as well. There's a really good one which is incredibly deep. The saw blade, in particular, must, I could tell by the width of the cut. It's about 1 centimeter thick. And when you look at these blocks, some of the blocks are sawn completely in half. And an interesting thing about this is, according to Petrie, he said that these basalt blocks were all sawn and fitted together. And when you first go there and you see the saw marks, you think that he's correct, because there's saw marks everywhere. But when you look a little bit closer, you find that some of the blocks only have one surface that has been sawn, and you can still see the lines from the tool going all the way down the surface of the block. But on the other side, which is already flat, there's no saw marks at all. It's just a flat, sort of bumpy surface, which again goes back to, I didn't mention his name before, but his name is Joseph Davidovits. He's the one that has the theory that the core and casing blocks of the Great Pyramid were poured stone concrete, basically. And he's got the recipe for it, and I wrote a chapter about him in my book. And like I said, the individuals from the Cairo University went over there and tested the North and South Pole and found it to be true that most of the blocks were poured. Well, he's also pouring granite in his laboratory in France. He's also pouring basalt, diorite, and many other stones. What he does is he finds basically old stone, like loose aggregate. If you've ever went hiking and you've seen, you're in the United States, right?
Right.
Okay, well, a lot of the granite in the United States is the black and white version.
Right.
And a lot of times if you're out hiking and you see a patch of it, it's just crumbly to the touch because of it's basically its age, and then water permeating through it, and then the sun heating it up and fracturing it like that. Well, according to Davidovits, this is what you would find. You find this loose aggregate, this old stone. You break it up into its smallest pieces, and then you add some chemical elements, and he's pouring this at room temperature. He's not melting molten granite or anything into a mold. He's basically pouring these into a mold at room temperature, using a few chemicals that he analyzed. A lot of the stones that were. Somebody gave him 2 samples from the Great Pyramids, and when he analyzed them, he found some chemicals in there that did not exist in any of the quarries, any of the known quarries over there in Egypt. So immediately to him, he found the recipe, the chemical recipe for the cement in his mind. So, without going too much into it, basically, it looks like the basalt blocks at the base of the Great Pyramid already had a flat surface, but it's just a little bit bumpy to the texture. They might have been poured into a mold, and then after that, they were trimmed here and there to get their size, just perfect before they were put together. That's why you see some of the blocks that have one side that's completely cut through. In some cases, the side was not even completely cut through. They just trimmed off a part of the corner, because maybe the next block was a little bit bigger, and it wasn't going to fit correctly, so they needed to do some trimming. And when you look at it closely, that's exactly what you see there. So the saw marks basically were used in some cases to make smaller blocks, I imagine, but in a lot of cases just to trim to get these things to fit. But again, we're talking about a fast-moving blade that, if we look at the King's Chamber, which there's a granite box that's in the King's Chamber. It's a solid one-piece granite box. And again, Petrie was the one that discovered this. He's discovered saw marks on the outside of that granite box. And this granite box is like 7 feet long on one side, the longest side. So he estimated that the saw blade to cut this must have been at least 9 feet in diameter.
Wow.
So you're talking about a 9-foot circular saw. I mean, that's just, you're talking about ancient Egyptians that are supposed to only have copper chisels and wooden mallets.
Right.
So obviously they did not do this. Obviously they did not make it. And in my book, I got the math of, how long it would have taken to chisel a one-piece granite box with copper chisels and wooden mallets versus, power tools. And
I think
it would have took 6 years or something like that.
Yeah, it was like near 6 years. That's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And one thing I want to make very clear to the audience, and you've touched on it, but I want to make sure they understand this, is that the mainstream belief was that all those stones had been quarried and then transported either, on some type of rolling mechanism, something along those lines. And
right.
The evidence that would suggest, based on what you have here, is that it seems quite obvious that the stones were poured rather than quarried.
Right.
So I want to make sure that for those who are less familiar, they understand just how vastly different that is from the mainstream. But the evidence certainly seems to support it. It's absolutely remarkable. Now, building on that, the technologies that are used here. I mean, we've talked about the core drills, we've talked about the saw tools, but there's also appears to be evidence that, of course, you mentioned the limestone concrete mix, but there's also evidence of some sort of high pressure tube ejection technology. Now, this is really interesting, and I want to make sure that you get a chance to talk a little bit about that, as well as those limestone spirals you discovered.
Right. Would you like me to go on about that?
Absolutely.
Okay. This is... let me try and jump to that chapter right now so I can have something to reference. But this is... I actually found this in the year 2000, and so I was kind of eager to get back there and take photographs of it. And so when I went back in 2009, that's basically what I did. But if you look behind the Great Pyramid, there's a series of, it's like a grid, basically, of what Egyptologists call mastaba buildings. And basically mastaba is an Arab word which means wall. And so it doesn't quite really do justice for what these are. They're rectangular buildings. They have 4 walls. They have a roof. The walls themselves are angled, very steep. If I were to guess, 80 or 75 degree slope or something like that. So it's a very steep angle, but they're angled. And on the ceiling of these, there's a square, almost like a sunroof or something like that. But what it actually is, I don't know. But so if you were to climb up on top of one of these, you would see one square cut out of the ceiling. Sometimes there's 2. And these rectangular buildings, there's many of them. They're laid out in a grid pattern, and they're separated by about, I'd say about 3 meters. So like a roadway for a single lane roadway for a car.
Okay.
And again, they're in a grid, so you have both laterally and vertically. You have these roads that separate these buildings. Well, one of them, in particular, which just happens to be on the corner. Still trying to get to that. Give me 1 second here. Okay. Oops.
The spirals that you have these pictures of, it's really remarkable because it appears as if though something, some sort of highly pressured water or something was moving through and creating this really unique looking spiral pattern. And of course, it's different than the core drills that we talked about. But
right. I'm there now, so I got the reference material. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, this mastaba, which to Egyptologists it's a tomb, okay, but it's got a door on one wall, and it's completely open. It's got some sort of like what looks like a hinge mechanism. It's a round cylindrical crossbeam at the top of the door. The door itself is inset into the wall. On the outside of the door, the whole wall is inset, which makes it appear like something locked into place there. Like the door is actually wider than the walkway that you walk through, like a big flap that would just close shut and seal, and be perfectly tucked in there. So that's kind of conspicuous. And then you look on the other side, the other wall, there's 4 what look like windows which go into the structure. But this is where the pressure vent is. I call it a high pressure reduction vent, I think is what I called it, because basically you look inside one of these windows, and one of them is broken, so I could crawl in and actually get inside and get the photographs that are in the book. And you see that it's a shaft that continues for about 4 to 5 feet, and then it gets narrower and narrower, but it's a direct angle. It's kind of hard to describe, but at the very end there's just a slot that's about 1 inch wide by about 8 inches long, and it's comprised of many blocks. So these blocks are actually cut in such a way that they interlock. So the amount of pressure that they could withstand is, just by looking at how durable the blocks are, how they interlock together, how they were put into place, and then how this thing funnels itself, the shaft funnels itself to one singular slot. It makes it look like a jet, like a water jet or a nozzle. That's basically why I call it a high pressure nozzle. And there's 4 of these that are inside this building on the one wall you can see. And I've mentioned this to some other people, and they're like, well, maybe it's I guess the Egyptologists might say that that's a window for the dead pharaoh's soul to return into, or something hokey like that. But other people have suggested that maybe it was like a smelting, for like there was a billows that was hooked up to the back of that to push air through for smelting of metals or something. Which that's fair guess and stuff. But when you look in, there's no evidence of fire inside this structure at all either. And when you look at the top, like I mentioned, there was about a 5 foot by 5 foot square shaft, basically, that goes straight through the center of the roof. Well, those go to a depth of about 60 to 80 feet. And then down there's a room, and this is what led Egyptologists to believe these were tombs, but these were certainly not sealed off. You could, rappel down there and go and steal the gold and jewels and mummy, if that's what it was, They most likely were used like that by the Egyptians, if we remember by the theory that I'm putting forth that the Egyptians did not build this building. They just inhabited it later.
Right.
So most certainly they were used as tombs, and the Egyptologist is correct in that regards, except that they just did not build it. They renovated it, refurbished it, retrofitted it, and then used it for their purposes. So this is an amazing structure. It's pretty much baffling. Like, I did my best to explain it based on the evidences that are there. There's a sloped part of the roof, and then there's an angular part of the roof, which is half of it's sloped and half of it's rounded, which baffles me. It almost like it had some sort of function. It was deliberately done that way. Obviously, the rounded part of the roof going down to the wall is a perfect rounded angle. There's no mistake in curvature as you go along the top. And then the rest of the half is they stopped cutting the round, and then they kept it basically almost a 90-degree angle. So almost like the roof itself had some sort of function. And so this thing just screams functionality. But, was it part of, like I said before, lots of people have theorized that the pyramid was some type of machine. And there's a lot of good theories out there that, well, two in particular. There's not a lot, but there's only two. But, and I've read up on both of those extensively. And these are one of them is by a mechanical engineer. I mentioned his name earlier, Christopher Dunn. And he's got a lot of support for his theory from, other engineers in his field. And the other was the individual I worked with, Larry Hunter, back in 1997. And he was the one that said it was a solar reflector and collector device. So, if those hold true, then this, little structure that's right next to the pyramid could have been part of the system, in some way, or it could have been something that had to do with the construction of the pyramid. I don't know, some mechanical,
Right.
But it's just completely baffling. But when the photographs in the book are astounding. When you look at it, you can see it's a full-on reduction nozzle or vent, pressure vent of some kind. And they could easily have created a lot of force and a lot of pressure, so whatever was being shot, out that vent, would have been under extreme, pressure. And the structure itself, the interlocking blocks, could have supported that, no problem.
Wow. Some remarkable photos you have there. And they do look as if, though, they have some sort of function, other than just some sort of decorative, grave site, so to speak. It's really remarkable. I just amazed at some of the images, and they're the kind of images in the photos you've taken. When you picked up your history book in high school, you didn't see any of these pictures.
No,
you would see the outside. But you would never really see those kinds of photos. You don't even see them in the Egyptologist books, like right.
Mark Lenner, The Complete Pyramids by Mark Lenner, who's the number one American Egyptologist. He's when you look at a show on Egypt, there's going to be Zahi Hawass and there's going to be Mark Leonard. They're pretty much inseparable. But in his book, yeah, this is not in there, and this is strange. This is a big anomaly. Like one theory is that they were to allow sunlight, to just a little bit of sunlight, like 1 inch by a slot of sunlight, 1 inch by 8 inches or whatever that you see in the photograph. Well, if that was the case, you wouldn't need interlocking blocks to, hold back sunlight.
Right.
Sunlight has no pressure whatsoever. You could have just had one block that was cut out in the same manner, and that would have achieved, what you needed to put sunlight, through a funnel and create this little slot. You wouldn't need to have these interlocking blocks, so yeah, it's just baffling.
Absolutely. Now, moving ahead a little bit here, you also talk that there appears to be some sort of evidence of like hydraulic engineering. Would you care to go into a little depth and detail into that as well?
Yeah, that's basically, there was another chapter that didn't make it into my book. I may do a rewrite in the future where I combine volume 1 and 2 together and throw in some more chapters. But there were some legal issues with the use of his material, so didn't make it in. But his name is Edward J. Kunkel, and he was an American hydraulic engineer back in the early 1930s during the Depression. And he wrote a book called The Pharaoh's Pump. And within the Egyptology circle, maybe they've heard of him, but certainly people that study pyramids in their spare time, like myself, they've all heard of Mr. Kunkel and his theory. And he said that the pyramid was built with the use of a water pump. So they created the subterranean chamber first that was cut into the foundation, way deep into the foundation at an angle. And basically, if they forced water down that shaft into the subterranean chamber, the air would get trapped down below and would basically compress against the ceiling. And all of this is sealed. It's within the foundation of the plateau, basically. So it's completely airtight and completely sealed. So the air would have compressed against the ceiling of the chamber to a certain point where it would begin to push back. And then once it pushed back, a door that was, again, the core drill holes are found in this particular area as well. Like I mentioned, if you go to the Queen's Chamber, well, if you go down to the subterranean chamber, there's a similar drop in the floor, and there's core drill holes on the side where there used to be, it appears to be some sort of swinging door, like a hatch, which would slam shut against the lower foot, where I said the shaft comes down. And this thing would slam shut, and the water would be forced up through the... I'm drawing a blank on what this is, but it's there's a small shaft from the descending shaft that goes up to the Grand Gallery. It's called the well shaft. That's what it's called. And this is a smaller cavity, so it would act like a jet, and then it would be able to pump water up higher. So basically his theory is it started at ground level. They dug into the foundation, created this first pump, where they were able to pump water higher and higher. So each chamber, the first one after the subterranean chamber being the Queen's Chamber, once that was in place, the Queen's Chamber was used as a pump as well. And I don't know if you're familiar with it at all, but there's what they call air shafts that angle off of the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber.
Right.
Okay. Well, they sent robots up in the Queen's Chamber one. One of the robots found a door, and this is very popular recently because it was called Gantenbrink's door because he's the one that did the exploration of it first. And then they drilled a hole through that door and blah, blah, blah. But so basically the Queen's Chamber air shafts are sealed by the rest of the pyramid. Well, according to his theory, is those air shafts were used as the water jet for a period of time while the pyramid was halfway built. And then when the King's Chamber came online, they no longer needed the air shaft or the water jets in the Queen's Chamber, so then they built around them. And then they started using well, it wouldn't be the secondary pump at this point, it'd be the third pump, subterranean pump being the first pump, Queen's Chamber being the second pump, and then the King's Chamber being the third pump. And they would use the King's Chamber air shafts. Well, I'm calling them air shafts because that's what the Egyptologists call them, but according to this, they would be, shooting water out to the higher levels of the pyramid. And then, knowing now that these blocks were made out of concrete, this kind of makes perfect sense. Like, a lot of researchers, they get a little bit of an ego and they think that, they got their theory and that they have to be correct. Well, I'm coming at this from a journalist perspective, and, when I see that they've tested the blocks and they found that the north and south poles match, which proved that these blocks were poured in place. Okay, these blocks were concrete. And this guy says that the pyramid was used as a pump to funnel water higher and higher. He was saying to float the blocks, so he was using these large wooden rafts basically to float the blocks into place. So to give you a better idea about this, like if the pyramid was halfway finished, at the very top of that there would be like a lake, and so hence the need to pump the water up and create this sort of lake. The outer rim of the lake would be the outer blocks of the pyramid. So within the center of that lake would be workers that are like waist high in water, and according to his theory, floating these blocks into place. And it's quite elaborate and it's quite good, but that was in 1930, and a lot has changed since then. And in particular, this Joseph Davidovits, who discovered the cement theory. So it doesn't cancel him out altogether, because if it indeed was a pump, they would have needed water for concrete,
Absolutely.
For sure, and then a lot of it too, and they need it on site. They wouldn't, you wouldn't want to carry buckets from the Nile and just create a human chain,
right?
So, like a modern day construction site, you would have water on site, and you would have power tools doing drilling, you would have power tools doing cutting, you would have concrete being poured and mixed, and that's exactly what you see here on the plateau. And there was also some lathe work. We didn't talk about that here today, but there's photos of large scale lathe work, which we just started doing recently. There's some lathes that have been constructed recently to cut stone. They wanted to cut basically marble columns, and they wanted to look like cylindrical and have some patterns on them and stuff. So an individual, maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, made the first lathe to cut stone that we've had, in our history. But you go to the plateau and you see these huge pieces of stone with these curved angles, and that look like they were just spun on a lathe. So it's when you go to the Giza Plateau, if you've read my books and you've seen the photos, and then you happen to be fortunate enough to take a trip there and go to see it for yourself, you will find out that it just looks like a normal construction site that you would see, here today.
It's really remarkable. It's really remarkable work.
Yeah.
Now, another section in your book I wanted to get into here real quickly is what you've called the meltdown on the Giza Plateau.
Right.
Could you explain that in a little more detail?
Yeah, in my early years, basically my first trip when I went to Egypt in 1997, was I had just been turned on to the idea that this pyramid was potentially a very large and evacuated and broken down machine, a power generator, of two types of power. So it was completely fascinating. So I was thinking, okay, well, it's broken and it potentially was a power generator. Today we have nuclear power generators, and the term is, meltdown. Like, I'm here in Japan, and in 2011 we had the Fukushima meltdown, and it's basically because of it's a uranium-based, a uranium fuel-based system. So, but when you read about the power generator theories of the pyramid, it doesn't involve uranium. It's basically transduction of different energies into different energies. So basically, the vibrations of the earth are changed into audible sound, and then those are focused within the king's chamber, and then some gases are added, et cetera, without getting too deep into that. But there's no uranium-based fuel in any of those theories. So there isn't a chance of a meltdown per se, not in the traditional sense. But I thought I'd look around for something fishy anyway. If it was a power generator and it's destroyed, perhaps there's some evidences of the destruction. So in 1997, I was walking around, and lo and behold, I find these fissures, basically, that are filled in with melted limestone, and it's a huge crack. And again, it was like a molten river, basically, at one point, and then it just hardened. And some of these come out from underneath the Great Pyramid, right by the northern entrance. They're covered in sand a lot of the time, so you got to brush it away to see it. And sometimes you got to pour your water bottle on it to make the colors come out. But I found this one area next to the second Great Pyramid, and it's just a huge fissure, a huge crack, and it comes out underneath the causeway of the second Great Pyramid, and it's melted through the whole causeway. And the colors on this is, again, I took a sample of it and compared it. In my book, you can see the photos of this. It looks just like a normal lava rock that you would find in a normal landscaping project somewhere. It's got the air pockets and stuff like that. And so it's melted limestone all over the plateau. There's melted limestone, and this part in particular, having cut through the causeway, basically, is telling, because the causeway was built, and then it's sort of hard to tell whether or not, because it looks like the Egyptians might have repaired it. So it could kind of go either way. Like perhaps the pyramid was here, and this destruction happened, and for whatever reason, earthquake or something, and then it is known that what the Ring of Fire is?
Yes.
Okay, well, part of it goes underneath Egypt, and the map I looked at was not a very accurate one, but it's in the general direction of where the Great Pyramids are. So, deep within the Earth's crust, there is a flow of magma that's moving underneath the country of Egypt. And again, it's in the vicinity of the Great Pyramids. So, perhaps way back in history, before the pyramids were here, there was some tectonic shifting, and some of this magma made its way up to the surface and started cutting through. Or perhaps the pyramids were here, and during their destruction, like one of the theories is they harnessed the Earth's vibrations, and like I said, converted that into audible sound, and then converted that again, and the end result is a microwave energy beam. Well, if that got out of control, the whole pyramid was vibrating, according to this theory, but in a controlled way. But if that ever got out of control, it would continue to vibrate and vibrate to a point where it would just, possibly create, fissures in the ground and cracks and, a meltdown, basically. So, and that was proposed in Christopher Dunn's book, that because there is, if you look inside the king's chamber, the granite beams are cracked in, two of them are cracked completely in half. And he said that there might have been a misfire inside the pyramid where the hydrogen gas that was used to basically excite the molecules and be able to amplify the system, amplify the energy, that there might have been a misfire of that gas which caused a huge explosion, which would have pushed the beam up, slammed it back down, even just by small amount of like 1 inch. And so basically there's evidence of destruction inside the pyramid and there's evidence of destruction on the plateau. Whether or not the two of those go hand in hand, I don't know. But again, this has not been documented by Egyptologists. It's not even of concern to them. This melts right through the causeway, like I said. So if it turns out that the causeway was built, and it needs closer examination, I will admit that. But upon closer examination, if it is found that part of the original causeway was melted through by this, occurrence, then we have some sort of meltdown that took place after the pyramids were built. And, that's what that would say. But, again, it needs closer examination. But in my chapter, I did my best to, basically lay all the variables and possibilities out there. But
well, it's remarkable work. And before we wrap up this interview, one thing in particular I wanted to get into, and that's that you postulate that the Egyptians perhaps were restorers of the Great Pyramids. And so my question to you is, based on everything that you've put forward here, we see evidence of advanced technology use here. We see in multiple forms. It appears, based on the evidence, that the pyramids are much older than what anybody previously thought. So the question that I came to while reading this is, if the Egyptians were the restorers, then who were the builders?
Right. So, excellent question. And it's one that's been on my mind for as many years as I've been involved in this. It's kind of tied to how old the pyramids are, in some respect, because like the first individual I was working with, he was convinced that these were 65 million years plus old, because for him it had to be the meteor impact that happened 65 million years ago that scientists say wiped off the dinosaurs off the face of the earth. For him, that was the destruction period of the pyramids. And the reason being is the pyramid was built so perfect. There's too many things to go into, with you right here, but they used the golden mean. They knew about pi, and the Egyptians didn't know about these. These weren't discovered until, the Greeks came around, hundreds of years later, thousands of years later. So if the Egyptians had no knowledge of these mathematics, forms of mathematics, and they were used in the building of the pyramid, then you have to admit that the Egyptians did not build the pyramid because they didn't have the knowledge. And so what do you see them having? You see them having copper chisels and wooden mallets. But what do you see in the stones? You see high-powered saws, high-powered drills, as you mentioned, and lathes and high-powered lathe work. So again, the Egyptians just had copper chisels and wooden mallets, so they didn't even have the tools to build it. So there's a lot of evidence that shows the Egyptians were restoring it, and we won't get into that. I'll try and answer your question better, but as to who actually built it, like I said, it's sort of tied to the age. So we have one individual that says 65 million years old, and a lot of people really get off the bus at that point. They just can't fathom that could even be a possibility for whatever personal reasons they may have or whatever. But so I consider it just a possibility because this individual says that this building was so perfect. It had to be from a time in our history where everything was not chaotic. So before 65 million years ago, the Earth was basically a biosphere. There was no ice at the polar caps. There was a firmament. It's mentioned in the book of Genesis, if you believe in that sort of thing. But the scientists also mentioned it, that there was a firmament during the time of the dinosaurs. And a firmament is basically a cloud cover. So there was one big giant cloud that covered the whole entire planet. And it would block ultraviolet rays, so potentially things could live a lot longer due to cell degradation that wouldn't be occurring because there's no ultraviolet rays. There would be no rain because it would just be a fine mist. The whole planet would be like a rainforest, basically. And this is kind of what you see with the woolly mammoths that were being pulled out of the ice. They had, tropical food in their stomachs, and this is much later than, dinosaurs. But if you could imagine that the whole planet was pretty much a Garden of Eden, if I may say that, it's pretty much like a biosphere without the use of, you wouldn't need a glass dome. You just need a sufficient atmosphere and sufficient cloud cover. And so everything was pretty much stable pre-65 million years ago. So for him, whoever built it was during this time, and during during a period of planetary peace, basically, and stability. And so after 65 million years ago, we had this comet impact, and then that ripped a hole through our atmosphere, which caused, massive amounts of rain and flooding, and then we have, polar ice caps and earthquakes, and we have a wobble, and there's, from that impact, I don't know if this has been proven or not, but this was his idea, that we have basically 5 extra days in our year. The year, some of this is in Egyptian myth and legend too, that the year used to be 360 days, but then something caused it to go off schedule, and to where we needed to add 5 extra days in the year to make up. And so a big, massive impact to the Earth is the only way that you could shift our orbit enough to add 5 extra days. So there's a lot of little things that go along with his theory, and I've known him for many years, and I myself have only been able to come to grips with this, quite recently. So that's one possibility. Then you go from there, you go into the periods of chaos, which a lot of people think the pyramids were built 10,000 years ago because of the recent discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Right. If you're familiar with that. Well, this is these people were, they think, are perhaps Neanderthal or some early human, basically cavemen at the end of the last ice age. But they're building these huge megalithic columns, and I've seen the photos of Göbekli Tepe, and the stones are massive and impressive, but in no way reflect the work of the Great Pyramids themselves. I mean, there's a bit of primitive, make up a word, primitiveness to them when you see them. You don't see any saw marks, you don't see any core drill holes, but you have these massive single stone columns that were, and there's lots of them. So a lot of people think it's just convenient to say 10,000 years because you have a megalithic structure called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey that's discovered to be around 10 to 12,000 years old. And this was previously unknown, and the oldest civilization before that was supposed to be Sumeria 6,000 years ago. And then you got Egypt, which is 4,000 years ago, according to Egyptologists. But as we were just mentioning, that the Egyptians don't have the tools, they didn't have the mathematics, so you have flood evidence where the pyramids are surrounded by, basically the Mediterranean Sea for many hundreds of years. And you add all this up together, and the pyramids were, probably far older than Göbekli Tepe, 10,000 years. But again, you say 65 million years ago, and everybody gets off the bus. So, so what are you to do? But I think that your audience is, a lot more open-minded than most individuals. So, if it's 65 million years ago, it's not humans, because the human species has only been around, according to modern scientists, 200,000 years ago. Homo sapiens sapiens. Recently, they just found out that there's some missing DNA in our code, that it's from some unknown human, or humanoid, or something. They don't know who it is or what it is, and they have no evidence of this creature on Earth so far. And of course, modern scientists think they just haven't found it yet. But I'm privy to Zecharia Sitchin and his work, and I found it quite fascinating that potentially people from other planets had come here, perhaps long ago, perhaps 65 million years ago, and then during the time when there was planetary, for lack of a better word, peace, not a period of non-chaos, and they set up a power generator, and then who knows what they were doing. But part of Zecharia Sitchin's work was that that they actually modified our DNA. They took maybe some samples of some creatures here and created an Adam and created an Eve, and then created a Garden of Eden, so to speak. And I also like who's that guy from area, Bob Lazar?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Out of all the individuals, I found him to be the most credible, because he was with I believe it was former CIA pilot John Lear, and that was a friend of his, and he said that he worked at Area 51 S4, and he was working on some alien craft, and he knew the testing times, and they went out there and they actually videoed it, and this is all well known, and so they were just sneaking out there, and right at this exact time that he said that they were going to be testing, this spaceship flies out over the mountain, did some impressive maneuvers, and I guess Bob missed that, but John Lear saw it, and they all videotaped it. And so that's quite impressive. And if you listen to his interview, if you believe, obviously I believe that because they videotaped it and he brought friends along. But if you believe the rest of the interview, he was given some debriefing by the military that aliens have been here for thousands of years, and they've been messing with probably not only our genetic code, but other animals as well, on multiple occasions. I think in the interview he says there's been about 7 to 8, I forget the word he uses, but adjustments or something to our DNA code by these creatures. So yeah, I'm open to the idea that, and again, the evidence suggests that this is really old, and if you go further back than 200,000 years, then there's just no humans there. So obviously humans did not build it. So, you have, presumably, you have, some other creatures that are human-like, more monkey, looking. So maybe there's a Planet of the Apes going on, and they weren't actually stupid. They looked like, monkeys, but, they had a human brain or something. I have no idea. Nobody has any idea, actually. But if we're going to speculate, yeah, aliens, okay, possibly. A pre-existing civilization, yeah, possibly. But if it's before 200,000 years ago, it was not human. If you believe modern science, and, which I basically do. These are smart individuals. They know what they're doing. They said there's a missing DNA code here. I trust them that's the case. What that DNA is, they don't know. We don't know. There's a lot going on, and those are the external pieces, that I would sort of put in, for myself to try and answer your question as to who built the pyramid. And like I said, it's tied hand in hand with when. So if it's pre-200,000 years ago, like I said, it's not human. It would, and if it's a pre-existing civilization that was from here, like I said, there'd probably some ape-like creatures that were, we presume them to be stupid because evolution suggests that you get smarter as you evolve,
Right.
But, we could be totally wrong on that. We were wrong on dinosaurs being stupid.
Yeah.
So, So who knows? So potentially, yeah, some other people from some other planet came here, built this building. They had the mathematics, they had the knowledge, they had the tools, and then a big destruction happened and a huge, massive flood. And this thing was built to last through time. I mean, this cannot be understated as well. The core blocks are significantly softer, but they're still pretty damn hard. If you go there and you touch them with yourself, you'll see. And the casing blocks are at least 10 times harder than that. So it's like the enamel over the tooth. So this was to protect the inner blocks. And the casing blocks are a meter thick. So when you have all these pyramids that are, encased in a meter thick limestone that is harder than the central blocks, I mean, you're talking about a structure that's basically indestructible through time, So, could it be there millions of years? Yeah. I have a hard time. If there was a huge, right now at the South Pole, there's 1,000 feet thick, sheet of ice covering the land, right?
Right.
Well, if that was the case over Egypt, then, anywhere within our past, like during the Ice Age, then no, the pyramid would just be crushed into dust. That would be the only thing that could basically, destroy the pyramid. It would be 1,000-foot thick sheet of ice. It would just crush it to dust, and it would move it, from Egypt all the way, to, Namibia or something. But, and I tried to find that out, if there was an ice sheet there, and I haven't been able to find out so far. But what we're dealing with is, potentially, according to one individual, who's, I've worked with, and he's quite smart, but again, everybody gets off the bus at that point, 65 million years ago. And then you got the popular answers, which are the most popular being 10,000 because of Göbekli Tepe, and then you got around 200 to 250,000 because of Zecharia Sitchin and his fans. But really, there's really no evidence that supports either of those. There's some floods that happened from 200,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, and that's due to the end of the last ice age. There was these things called ice dams, basically when everything started to melt. The last part to melt would be the ice dam, and then when that, you ever see that movie, it's like a Disney cartoon movie with a mammoth and Ice
Age.
Yeah, and the ice broke, and then there's this huge flood, and the animals are trying to escape before they tied it to global warming basically, and did a play on that. But if you saw that, that's basically what we're talking about. A huge sheet of ice basically, and it melted on top. So the last part to melt was basically what they call the dam, and then once that ruptured, it just released all that water and created a huge flood. And there were many of those from 200,000 years ago up until 10,000 years ago, and they were all around the planet. But this type of flood, it's debatable whether or not that could have caused what you see at the Great Pyramid, because again, the water level stayed for hundreds of years, enough to cause 3/4 of the block to just disappear, And this is very hard limestone, so whatever flood this was, it was massive, it was long-lasting, and it should be recorded, or should be able to be pinpointed, but
right.
Perhaps that's for smarter minds. And
well, one thing is for sure, your work has definitely, I think, opened the doors for more research to be done, by all means. I mean, there's opportunity here, and there is certainly enough evidence to suggest that the mainstream paradigm, this model of what we believe Egypt history to be, is not exactly accurate. So, Jerret, I want to thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
And now your books, What Egyptologists Don't Want You to See, Volume 1 and Volume 2, you can purchase those at Amazon.com, correct?
That's correct. People could also go to my website at www.gizanow.com. That's GIZANOW. And just follow the links there. There's also some sample chapters if they would like to read. Everything's available there on the webpage as well.
Okay, great. Okay, well, once again, Jerret, thank you for coming on the show, and I look forward to having you a guest on the future.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, Jerret Gardner. Once again, check out his website at www.gizanow.com. I'll be posting links to his Facebook page as well as to his website. And check out his book, What Egyptologists Don't Want You to See, Volume 1 and 2, available on Amazon.com as well. So once again, thank you for everybody for listening, and we will be back with you again next week. Have a great week.